From Fox 8 Sports, this is the Overtime Podcast.
From the Fox 8 studios in New Orleans, this is the Fox 8 Overtime Podcast. I am your host, Sean Fazende. Riding shotgun next to me as he does each and every podcast is Andre Johnson Jr. Do not forget the JR on the end of that name. Before we get into today's content, be sure to like, share, rate, and review. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, get the bell notifications for when we drop that fire content. We are back today for another episode. We must apologize. Wednesday, a little scheduling conflict. Couldn't quite get the pod dub. We're going to have one on Thursday and Friday this week to get the our normal number of 3 podcasts for the week. It is now Thursday of this week, and last time we spoke about the Saints draft class. So now we're a few days post-draft, and I think that was a good spot to go with the big picture. But before that, how are you feeling today?
Well, despite my constant pleading over the last 2 weeks in this podcast, the Pelicans did still get swept. So that's unfortunate. So now for our sports department, we are all in on Saints post-draft and college baseball.
It's that time of year. There's no doubt about it. And look, the Saints post-draft, the post-draft NFL wave of free agency is probably the most underrated, underappreciated, underdiscussed part of the NFL calendar because, as we know, they have their initial big-time free agency wave, the second wave, then the draft, then the post-draft, because the draft resets the board because after the draft, teams know what they will or will not be filling with certain spots, and they may draft a player, thus a player that they weren't expecting to be available on the open market might become available on the open market. So that's the way we're going to go today, because Dennis Allen was pretty upfront, pretty frank when he was asked about the post-draft free agency, the things that kind of loosen up and open up for a team. They're going to be active, and they've been active so far. They've signed Herron, the tackle, Lemieux, the guard center, and Will Harris, a very versatile secondary player that played cornerback, nickel, strong safety, and free safety for the Detroit Lions last year. So they've been fairly active post-free agency now over the last 3 or 4 days. But today, we are now looking at the board or the market that's still available and who we feel like could be the next or a good fit for the New Orleans Saints.
Right, and as we get into our top 3, we've each got 3, and for dramatic effect, we're going to start at 3. We're going to build our way up to 1 of guys who are out there in the free agency who could come into this team and have an immediate impact. And you'd be surprised that some of the guys who are still out there. You've got Pro Bowlers still out there, all pros still out there. So there are a lot of guys who are still unsigned who could potentially come to New Orleans. And like I said, make an impact on this team today. And Sean, we'll start with your number 3 guy.
Yeah, this is our wish list, our top 3. We're going to start with number 3. Number 3 for me was a guy, when we were going through the list, we sit next to each other in the office. I was like, whoa, he's still available? I just assumed he would have gotten signed by now, given his resume, given where he's at, given the productivity that he's had. That's wide receiver Tyler Boyd. If you recall back during free agency, he was one of the names that popped up. He was one of the names that popped up when we were talking about potential free agent wide receivers available. And look, the Saints have certainly addressed this position, but there's a lot of youth in that group. It got younger over the draft. When you talk about the draft and the undrafted free agents that they picked up at that position, they signed Cedric Wilson and Stanley Morgan from throughout the free agent period, the first wave. But until you have a guarantee or clear-cut vision of who your top 3 or 4 are going to be, I say add a veteran with a resume like this. He's 29 years old. He's been pretty healthy. 67 catches, 667 yards, 2 touchdowns last year. Bigger guy, can make the catch over the middle, especially when you watch the tape. It's time to keep adding there. It's time to keep investing. He's got a veteran presence, and he's been remarkably consistent throughout his career in Cincinnati, and that's over a span of a few quarterbacks and a few coaches. He's been steady. He's been consistent. I'm surprised, given the situation in Cincinnati with T. Higgins, that perhaps they haven't reached out to bring him back because he was a guy Joe Burrow was clearly comfortable with. So to me, I'm picking up the phone and I'm calling Tyler Boyd, the 29, almost 30-year-old, because I think he can be a nice addition to this offense, and I think he can fill a need that doesn't jump out at you, but when you really dig deep into the numbers, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Now, our number 1 and number 2 will be different, but we agree on our number 3.
Okay.
I also have T. Higgins, and I want to add the versatility. When he was first coming onto the scene in Cincinnati, he was the number 1 receiver. Then he slowly dropped down to the number 2 receiver when T. Higgins got drafted. Then when Jamar Chase gets drafted, he's kind of the slot guy, the number 3 guy. So he's played number 1, number 2, number 3. He's not unfamiliar with any of those roles. And you're going to sense a theme with all of my guys is a veteran presence. You look in that room and you've got, like you said, an incredibly young room. Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, A.T. Perry, Cedric Wilson, Bub Means, Equanimous St. Brown, and Stanley Morgan. All guys who could benefit from having a Tyler Boyd in the room. And while we're mentioning all of those receivers, we know Chris Olave is your number 1. You may or may not be sold on Rashid Shaheed being your number 2.
A true 2, right? Exactly.
Is he really a true 2 in the NFL? And we've seen Tyler Boyd be that.
Yeah.
So,
and then who's your 3? I mean, we all like A.T. Perry, but I mean, it was the end of last season when he came on, so there's no guarantee he picks it back up. So yeah, I'm with you.
Exactly. So Tyler Boyd could potentially step in and be your number 2, and you can maybe work Rashid Shaheed out the slot.
Yeah.
If you want to keep Rashid Shaheed on the outside, Tyler Boyd is familiar with the slot. So he brings versatility in with an offensive coordinator who we know loves versatility and loves being able to do multiple things. So I think Tyler Boyd, not only as a veteran presence in a very young receiver room, the versatility that he brings, the experience that he brings, and you mentioned it, 67 catches, 667 and 2 touchdowns last season for a number 3 wide receiver. That's pretty good.
And they lost the starting quarterback.
Exactly.
They lost the starting quarterback. So, I mean, and he's been steady. And, you know, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but he's been pretty healthy throughout his career as well. So, I mean, all that stuff matters when you talk about this stage of the game and what you really need and what you really are going to ultimately count on when the games start counting. What do we have next?
Up next, number 2 on the list. Who's your number 2 guy?
All right, my number 2 guy is a guy you all know very well, especially if you've been watching this podcast and watching the Saints over the years. It's Andrews Pete. Let's not overthink this. We've already said it. I joked after the James Hurst retirement they should dial 1-800-Andrews Pete because, frankly, that is a immediate need. And look, they added Taliese Fuanga in the draft. That's fantastic. I think that locks you down as your starting right tackle. I still think that is the path. Because as much as I want to believe Ramchek's got a little life left, everything they're telling me is saying they are planning for life without him. So if you got Fuanga at right tackle, Ruiz at right guard, McCoy at center, at the absolute best, got losing my headphones here, at the absolute best case scenario is Trevor Penning developing into something. And that's no guarantee.
Yep.
That is no guarantee, but he's going to get a clean, fresh start here. You need to add to this room, and you'll see he's not the only offensive lineman that I've added here. And he's played left tackle, he's played left guard. I understand it's a totally different scheme in terms of what they asked their guys to do, but there is some elements of what they ran in this new scheme, what they ran last year with the Saints in terms of the outside zone, wide zone type thing. But at the very least, he's still relatively young, 30, 31 years old. He's played a ton of football here in New Orleans, and he's had injury concerns in the past, but he didn't have them last year. And you are not just have needs. You are desperate at offensive line because you just don't have the known of the starting 5. Forget the depth for a second. Your starting 5, you still can't even pencil guys in with any sort of certainty. So he's played left tackle. He's played left guard. He's been productive. He's familiar. He knows, I guess he doesn't know this new coaching staff, but he knows the city. He knows this organization. Don't overthink it. Bring Andrews Pete back.
I'm of the same mindset, just I went into a different direction. I went with a guy that we discussed probably a couple months ago when we were talking about free agents they could sign before the draft, and that's David Bakhtiari, the former Green Bay left tackle, 3-time Pro Bowler, 2-time All-Pro left tackle, and I mentioned the veteran presence in the room when I was talking about Tyler Boyd. Having an All-Pro in there to mentor not only Trevor Penning, but the guy you just drafted in Taliese Fuanga, that's a huge deal. Now, the only negative for Bakhtiari is he is coming off a season-ending injury. But this is a guy who protected Aaron Rodgers' blind side for the majority of the time that he was in Green Bay. You don't have to wait. If he can be on the field, he's only 32 years old. That's not elderly in terms of an offensive lineman. If he's a guy who can produce day one, it takes the pressure off Trevor Penning to try to step in there and protect Derek Carr's blind side day one. Because right now, as things line up, that's something that he's in line to have to do. And I don't know if you trust Trevor Penning in that position yet. So it gives Trevor Penning, a veteran in the room, to help him out. It gives Fuanga on the right side, a veteran in the room, to teach him the ropes. And he's a guy who can step in. And if David Bakhtiari is healthy at left tackle, you ain't got to worry about that side. When he plays, he is giving you top-tier production. And that's a guy who I want in, if I'm the Saints, not only to give me one less thing to worry about when it comes to protecting Derek Carr, but to help build my young guys up.
Look, he's had an unfortunate run of injuries, but make no mistake about it. I've said this before, and I'll say it again because you just kind of hear things, you pick up on things when you're around players all the time. Like, if you were to poll offensive tackles who they believe in their prime was the best offensive tackle last 5-10 years, almost all of them would say Bakhtiari. That's how much respect he had around the league with the way he played the game. And I would have absolutely no problem with that, especially if it's a one-year rental type situation, because you can't play around here. I mean, you just can't play around here if you're the Saints. You've got to protect Derek Carr. So I like that one. Bakhtiari for you at 2. For 2 at me was Andrus Peat.
Now we go into our number 1 guy, the top need in the free agency for the Saints to address, and you feel like that is...
I'm going Dalton Risner, guard out of he spent his first part of his career with Denver, spent most of last season with the Minnesota Vikings. He's got 73 career starts. He's only missed 4 games in his career due to injury. He's 6'5", 312 pounds, only 29 years old. Wasn't great last year with Minnesota, but this is all in the same family, this offensive scheme, especially Denver, Minnesota. They've all had these elements of this wide zone, this type of Shanahan-esque type system. And now you talk about the Kubiak style of system. So if he was in Denver all that time, he clearly crossed paths with Clint Kubiak. So that could certainly be something. Now, he's a guy that, as I mentioned before, he's been a guy that's played in the trenches for a long time. 73 starts to only miss 4 games due to injury. That's something to certainly put on your resume as a great thing. And look, they say he's a better pass blocker than run blocker. All these guys are going to have some sort of flaw. But look, I just said, at best case scenario, Penning becomes your left tackle and you trust him. Who's your left guard? You still can't pencil that in. Is it Udo? Is it Saldiveri? Is it Lemieux? I think Risner would be your starting guard right away. Here's the catch, though, and he said this on Twitter, and this is probably why he's still available. He wants a starter contract.
Yep.
Okay? I looked at the Spotrac, the analytics site. They had his market value at 3 years, $30 million, so that's about $10 million a season. The Saints have shown this year that they're not putting long-term investments into free agents. I don't know if they would do that in this stage of free agency, but if the need was desperate enough up front along the offensive line, maybe they should consider it. That's the only drawback, and that's the reason why ultimately I don't think it would happen. But if I had my choice of anyone on the market right now based on what the Saints need, it would be Dalton Risner, guard, played for Minnesota and Denver throughout his career.
That would be a great pick. Where I went with mine was the one position that I feel like the Saints had a need at and they didn't address in the draft. We talked on Monday about them drafting Kool-Aid McKinstry, really good player. He's a cornerback. I thought if they were going to go secondary, they would go safety. If you look at the free agent safeties, there's a guy by the name of Justin Simmons. Still available to this day, and similar to the guy you named, Dalton Risner, you're going to have to make the contract work. It would have to be maybe a similar to Chase Young contract, 1 year, prove-it deal, set yourself up to make a lot of money in the future. But if you can do that, he was a Pro Bowler last year. He was a second-team All-Pro last year. That's a ball hog, and sticking with my theme of veterans. Right now, at that safety spot, you lost Marcus May, so if the season started today, it would probably be Jordan Howden stepping in. And Jordan Howden looked good at times last year, but are you ready to trust him to be your every down safety? Maybe, maybe not. But you bring a guy like Justin Simmons in, it takes the pressure off of your young guy to play immediately. I promise you, Jordan Howden will learn a whole lot from being in a room with Justin Simmons. And, I mean, from a talent perspective, from a need perspective, assuming Marshawn Lattimore stays, that secondary starts to look a little dangerous. You've got Lattimore, you've got Simmons, you still got whatever Tyrann Mathieu can still give you around, Paulson Adebo, who was arguably your best defensive player last year, and you've got Alontae Taylor and Kool-Aid McKinstry mixing in there. That secondary might be the strongest unit on your team if you can bring a guy like Justin Simmons in.
I love it. Now, look, I wouldn't break the bank for him.
Yeah.
They got caught with that a few years ago and ended up not working out for him. I ain't gonna say his name. Y'all remember his name? It was back in 2014, about a decade ago. If you can somehow convince him to be like, yo, just come with us for that 1 year bet on yourself deal and get that big contract. If the Saints can somehow land that kind of bargain for a player like that, like Chase Long, like you said, man, that elevates everything on the defensive side of the ball, and immediately it becomes one of the strongest secondaries in the entire league, if not the best secondary on paper in the entire league. He was on my honorable mention list. The only reason why I put him honorable mention is because I got a feeling based off his career, his resume, what he's done, he's probably looking for a really, really big contract. And he's arguably a top, 5 safety in the NFL. So top 5 money, I just think would be a little high to price the Saints out. But if you can somehow, later this thing gets, if you can jump in with a, hey, look, we can't offer you a max deal, but you want to do an incentive deal with us, very makeable incentives. You can make a lot of money and you hit the free agent market again next year, show you still got it. I would have absolutely no problem with Justin Simmons.
Definitely. I mean, he's still out there right now because so far out of the 32 teams in the league, nobody has looked at him and said, hey, we're going to give you max money. So at this point in the free agency, I would agree. Obviously you got number one is making the salary work, but if you can do that, he's a guy who steps in is one of the best players on the entire team day one. And I know you mentioned honorable mentions. Dalton Risner, Andrus Peat, 2 guys you had. They were 2 of my honorable mentions. I threw in Donovan Smith, who can play that tackle position, similar to Bakhtiari. He can help mentor a Trevor Penning, a Fuanga. And I threw in a guy who we talked about a couple months ago, a guy many New Orleans fans, Saints fans, LSU fans are familiar with, Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I don't think he can step in and maybe have the immediate impact that a Tyler Boyd can have, but a guy who would be a nice coming home story, a guy who can obviously mentor those young guys in the room. And I think he's still got, now maybe you're not relying in game planning around Odell Beckham Jr., but can he still contribute, especially with the way this receiver room looks? I think he definitely
As a
can.
3. Yeah, I think he can still be a 3 in the league. Still be a 3. So like a major concern for me, both on the Saints roster and what is available on the market, is that defensive tackle. It's a hard position to find. It's a hard position to find late. They addressed it in the draft, but it was later. I know Boyd will have a chance to make the roster, but still, it's a 6th-round pick from Northern Iowa. I mean, you can't. I'm a little concerned at how thin they are up there at defensive tackle. So I had to put some D tackles on my honorable mentions, but man, they've got some major red flags. I mean, Hassan Ridgeway, 29 years old, 6'3", 305. He's coming off a season-ending injury. Again, a depth guy, 6'3", 305. He could probably be more of a 3 tech, but you never know what they possibly would use him as. And then Brian Monet, nose tackle, 28 years old, 6'3", 345, coming off of an ACL. Another depth guy, played his career with Seattle, 6'3", 345. He's a nose tackle. He's gonna shade the center, or he's gonna be there to stuff the run. We know that, a first or second down type player to maybe help in that regard. But the options, they were really thin. They were either really banged up, coming off season-ending injuries like this, or they were all north of 33, 34 years old. It's a tough position. It's a tough place to find. So they're going to have to coach those guys up. Yeah. The D-line coach is going to have to coach those guys up, and there's going to have to be who ultimately develops at D-tackle past the front line, I think is probably a bigger need, a bigger concern for the Saints that perhaps people have realized. But that was my honorable mentions.
Yeah, because when you look at the D-tackle spot, obviously Brian Brzee is still there, and last year Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard were good. And honestly, I think they're still better than any option you've got at the free agency. And when you start to look at the Saints' needs post-draft, obviously offensive line is still there, and you can argue that D-tackle is second. But with the available options, it's kind of, you just got to kick that can down the road for now and start looking into the future. At least you do have one, and Brian Brzee, who had a good rookie year. Yeah. And for now, I don't think there's anything you can really do to improve that position by leaps and bounds, considering what's out there.
I think you're right. So coach up Boyd, that's one thing.
Yeah.
Then, pass rushing downs, you can maybe kick Tano Passanio inside. I know there are times, Cam Jordan is kicked inside in pass rushing situations, but on rundowns, I mean, I still think that's a vulnerability. Depth. at defensive tackle. So I'll refresh my list. 1, Dalton Risner. 2, Andrus Peat. 3, Tyler Boyd, with Hassan Ridgeway, Brian Monet, maybe y'all know how to say that name, and then Justin Simmons as my honorable mentions. What about yours again?
Number 1 was Justin Simmons. Number 2, David Bakhtiari. Number 3, Tyler Boyd. And with the honorable mentions, we had Dalton Risner, Donovan Smith, Andrus Peat, Odell Beckham Jr., and I'll throw one more safety in there, the former Chicago Bear, Eddie Jackson.
I like it. Good list. And look, this is an important part of the process. This was the wave they found Tyrann Mathieu a couple seasons ago. Jarvis Landry came in this wave. The Jarvis Landry thing didn't work out. Tyrann Mathieu, to me, has. It's really worked out the 2 years he's been in New Orleans. So pay attention to this part of the calendar because they're adding some players. The rookies get on the field, and then at the end of the month, OTA's on-field work starts, and that's where the building blocks, and that's our first look at what this 2024 New Orleans Saints team could potentially be. Anything else for us today?
We good.
We good on this Thursday. That is Andre Johnson Jr. I am Sean Fazende. We'll catch you guys next time on Overtime.